We'll turn now for comments to Kayvon Tehranian.
First and foremost, I want to thank Professor John Strickgruber for inviting me to here. It's a tremendous honor, and it's funny to be now speaking when so often I was, in the role as the audience or organizing these things. And thank you to the students that put this together. I know you're paying well. I'm technically a commentator, so this role was a bit ambiguous for me because I think it's a little bit difficult to, seeing as I just listened to East Timor, Lebanon, China, Afghanistan, and war crimes, to synthesize all that together. So instead, I'm going to exacerbate the problem and add my own topic, which I will describe as technology. And as the purported technologist, I was actually the former Liechtenstein Institute webmaster, and that gives me tremendous credibility to speak on the subject. I wanted to take a few minutes to offer my thoughts on the intersection of crisis diplomacy and technology. And first and foremost, because I'm fascinated by the way in which technology itself has come to dominate the narrative of many of the most recent crises on the international stage. But as well because this conversation will immediately touch upon an issue near and dear to my involvement with the Liechtenstein Institute, namely the interminable Iranian struggle for democracy. Much has been made of the digital revolution, and much of it I won't discuss here, but I'd like to consider the year 2009. Which is a particularly interesting case study given what took place in Moldova and Iran. The latter of which I'm happy to speak about in great detail. The former I use only for the purpose of corroboration. I don't know that much about Moldova, and I don't purport to be an expert. Other than to suffice to say that both Iran and Moldova experienced what have been deemed Twitter revolutions in 2009, so-called for their supporters' reliance on Twitter, the SMS social networking platform. The uprising in Moldova was characterized by its 15,000 demonstrators who ultimately stormed the capital to demand the results of the fraudulent parliamentary elections to be overturned. Certainly a newsworthy event in and of itself, but as the mainstream media would have you believe, it was even more relevant and even more newsworthy because of the instrumental role that Twitter played in orchestrating the civil unrest. In contrast to the color revolutions before it, be it the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the Moldovan insurrection was summarily defined by Twitter. And whereas once activists were defined by their causes, they seem to be now being defined by their tools. And I think that's a very interesting development. And this narrative found further steam by the events that unfolded in Iran only 3 months later, when demonstrators took to the streets to protest the disputed victory of Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was re-elected despite all indications that the Iranian people had voted otherwise. Here again, technology took center stage, though. A tool capable of catalyzing revolutionary foment was the headlines, a news story in and of itself. A second Twitter revolution in the span of 3 short months. For a service that was spawned on a restaurant napkin only 3 years before, that's quite a remarkable achievement. But I don't think this Twitter narrative has attracted the scrutiny it deserves. Consider the fact that most of Iran's network capacity was purposely disabled by the Iranian government both before, during, and after the election. Consider the fact that most of the Twitter posts that the media cited during the course of the protests that you saw on CNN were in English and not in Farsi. And consider the fact that the vast majority of these posts originated from Twitter accounts outside of Iran and not from within it, mostly from countries in the West that have ample broadband connections. Lost in all of this fervor was the fact that Twitter was the side story and not the central issue at stake. Yet somehow it came to dominate the conversation, at least in the broader media's narrative. But why do I bring this up in the context of crisis diplomacy? Because I believe that these Twitter revolutions were inaccurately portrayed, or at least widely skewed, by the fact that the crisis diplomacy surrounding these events was far too focused on the technology narrative to the detriment of substance, which was often pushed to the periphery as a result. To offer an example, consider to what extent the majority of those covering the Iranian election results were concerned with or even informed of Mir Hossein Mousavi's actual political platform, which I'll remind you had ample in common with the most conservative elements of Iran's political establishment. And most importantly, he wasn't about to put a stop to the nuclear program. In no way was he the liberal messiah that the Twitter narrative would have you believe. The Twitter narrative had simply overshadowed the facts on the ground. If anything, what people remember from the protests is the indelible image of Neda Agha Sultan, whose death was vividly captured on YouTube. or the last-minute call from Jared Cohen, who was at policy planning under Dean Slaughter at the U.S. State Department, to Twitter to keep up the service, despite the fact that most people using it were in the United States. Thus, they had the maintenance time corresponding to Eastern Standard Time and not, what people are doing in Iran. But, at the end of the day, I think the most important damning variable of all of this is the indictment of this narrative is the fact that there was no actual revolution. Despite Twitter, despite YouTube, despite Google, Ahmadinejad is still very much the president of Iran, and Khamenei is still very much in control of this country. Ultimately, I find the development of this narrative dangerous for two reasons. Firstly, because it disseminates the mistruth that technology is a panacea capable of curing social ills, when in fact technology, and specifically social technology, is an amoral device. It can be cut both ways, just as the industrial and nuclear revolutions were before, and it was harnessed by both sides of any conflict, and just as Al-Qaeda uses the internet to share information and recruit new members. And secondly, because the obsession over technology often distracts us from the central idea at the root of an issue. A salient example, again, being the failure of the media to grasp the realities of Iran's political system, conflating Mossavi with utopian ideals embodied in Twitter, or perhaps even on a grander scale, assuming that technology will trump ideology in China, as embodied by the diplomatic saga over Google's operations in mainland China. This is why I believe institutions like the Liechtenstein Institute are so important, because ideas still matter and they're still what drives social change, irrespective of the technology with which they are communicated. And while the speed at which crisis diplomacy occurs may have changed dramatically as a result of digital and social technologies, the fundamental issues that foment these crises remain unchanged, emphasizing the continued need for reasoned analysis and complex thinking, and at 140 characters per entry, something that Twitter clearly will not provide. It strikes me that if the changing technological dynamics are annihilating 20th century business models, which they certainly are, it becomes that much more important for LISD or similar institutions to exist. You need liberal institutions like it, where discussion can take place at a high level, for democracy to work, for crisis diplomacy to be appropriately contextualized, for questions of weight to receive a serious hearing, especially when the media is caught in the technology delirium as it was in both Moldova and Iran in 2009. As we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Liechtenstein Institute, it's interesting to consider what the world was like in 2000 when it was first started. While the watershed moment of 9/11 has been most commonly cited by those before me, I like to take a more technological perspective and offer this vantage point. In 2000, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have YouTube, and the concept of search engine was only beginning to become a part of our daily lives. Yet in this terribly primitive milieu, LISD was founded, incredibly so. And while the advent of these new technologies has certainly changed the way in which discourse takes place, as LISD is indeed on Twitter as of this year, I question to what extent, if any, the substance of that discourse has changed as a result of these technologies. Thank you.